Let's use an example. Out of the box, when you create a new SharePoint site, you actually have a few things you have to fill out. You have to give it a name, a description. You have to give it information. But when you give that information, you're not asked, does this relate to a department? You're not asked, does this relate to a product? You're not asked, does this relate to a customer, and so on and so forth. And because we don't ask that information, we're missing that information when it comes to managing the space. IT is essentially, working through an opaque barrier of needing the business to give them all that context, and it's extremely inefficient, right, to do that exercise. So we'll talk about that in a little bit.
2toLead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
Another interesting pattern here is for a lot of customers, they're going through migrations or maybe just finished a migration. And during migrations, you actually do all this. When you look at your landscape of sites and teams and things like that, you say, well, which ones relate to a department? Which ones relate? Like, you actually end up doing a lot of this exercise. And then we have that point in time insight, and then we often, forget about it after the end of the migration project. So, if you are, on your way to a migration project, this is a great opportunity to think about sort of a registry of these spaces where you keep and maintain some of that information. So what's one way to help make that maintenance of a registry of these spaces where you have that business context easier? Well, you could create a form. So instead of using this out of the box form, you could create your own form, right? And have people go through that. Think of it as a request form that people fill out, and then based on that request, you would go and automate the creation of that space. So there are examples that Microsoft has created in like app templates like this one, where you can do request teams, you can clone your requests or copy your requests, which makes it quite easy. So there's some really interesting and clever features in this free GitHub repo. But what's interesting, I think, about this is that for most customers, the feedback I give here is it's better to have a sort of everything digital workplace form. Like, I want a digital workspace, and this is what I need. Like, this is my desire. This is what I know about it, etc. And then hopefully that can tailor and template the right types of space so that they don't need to decide if it's a SharePoint site or team, a Power BI workspace. You do that for them, right? You give them the guidance for that. Obviously, if they make that distinction, right, you can give them a way to override it, but that's a really great way to also make the process easier, because instead of, in this example, if you go and grab it, instead of this being just for teams, we would have a single form or single process that people could use for SharePoint sites, for teams, for Yammer communities, etc. So I really do encourage consolidating that, because it makes the governance stuff that we'll talk about later in this registry process a lot easier to manage. But it's okay if you have a lot of different ways to create spaces, as long as those spaces have the ability for you to extend them and ask things like, what's the business reason and what department does this relate to, etc., because we're going to use that information in a really rich way. Let's talk about that information. Why do I keep stressing it's so important to know this information as soon as possible about a site? Even if those sites already exist, we should still go through the exercise of finding that information out. Why? Because if we know about that, we can do more. If we know about that information, we can enable content protection and content retention scenarios that we couldn't otherwise. Imagine trying to apply, because we see this all the time, an organization wants to apply a rule where all of the HR related content has a retention period of 7 years. But the thing is HR content could be in a project site, it could be in a variety of different spaces, not just the core departmental portal of HR, right? And the core departmental maybe sort of collaboration environment for HR. So the question then is, where is all that other content? Well, if we ask this question, which department is the primary lead, or what's the major department that this content resides over, we'll get that. We'll get that HR is related to that. And so now we can actually apply, especially if you use default metadata, which is something I would encourage, right? So if you get someone to give you this information, department equals HR, why not make it so that that space that you've provisioned, hopefully in an automated way, or even that space that already exists, just use a bit of PowerShell, set it up so that everything in there defaults to department equals HR. If I drag and drop a document into a library in that site, department equals HR is applied to it. That improves search, that improves roll-ups, that improves the information protection and enablement scenarios that I'm describing. It improves all of these scenarios because now we have that metadata and the user didn't have to do anything about it. If the user stores the document in the right place, or they create the news article or the event or whatever it is, right? If they create the item in the right space, it will automatically inherit information about that space. That feature has been around for years, decade, Over a decade, that feature has been in SharePoint, and yet so many customers don't use this idea of default metadata, which is so powerful. So that metadata that we get about the space can be used for default metadata, can be used for improved search, all these other things, but it can also be used to improve the templating itself. When you create those templates, when you create those spaces, if we know that it's a project site and we know that it has customer information or it's going to be accessible to customers or things like that through the request process, we might provision a very different layout and structure and organizational model than if we did the other way. We might have very different rules for monitoring and reviewing and certifying that space, on a regular basis. Very different governance, operational, and programmatic rules that apply based on this metadata. So it is very important. Asking sensitivity is not enough. Too many organizations go, well, if we just know it's highly confidential, we'll have a generic rule set for that. No, you want to know, is it related to HR and highly confidential, or is it related to like lab results and highly confidential if you're like a pharma? Like those are very different patterns that are really important to acknowledge. So anyways, the point is we all get it. Metadata is really. Hey everyone. So as mentioned, there's a dense 50 minutes of content here. I'm always a big fan of giving you guys too much information and insight. So do expect to kind of drink from the fire hose. And with that, let me just quickly describe why I'm here and why I'm talking to you about this particular topic area.